Listen close, because I have to tell you a story about dignity, betrayal, and a secret held tight in the darkest corners of a gleaming corporate tower. This isn't about billionaires and fancy yachts. It's about a man named Stanley Walker and the way the world treats the quiet ones. Stanley was 68 years old, carrying the kind of quiet pride that comes from 14 long years of hard work. He was the contracted janitor at Cornerstone Capital Partners, scrubbing the marble floors and polishing the brass rails in the executive suite. He worked diligently, not for luxury, but for necessity, to keep his independence and, most importantly, to care for his sweet wife, Eleanor, whose frail heart condition meant every doctor's bill was a looming shadow. Stanley was invisible, and that's how he liked it. He kept his head down, he did his job, and he never asked for a single thing. But the corporate world is a cold place, built on image and greed. And the man sitting at the top, the new CEO, Derek Callahan, was the greediest of all. Callahan, a smug man barely into his 40s, was drowning in debt. The kind of six-figure debt that makes people desperate. And when desperate men need a scapegoat, they always look for the one person they think is too quiet, too powerless, to fight back. It happened late Tuesday night on the 38th floor. Callahan burst out of his office, his face twisted in a performance of outrage. He stood over Stanley, who was quietly wiping down the mahogany desk, and pointed a shaking finger. "Where is it, old man?" Callahan roared, echoing down the empty halls. "My Patek Philippe, the diamond watch, worth $45,000. You stole it." Stanley, who hadn't taken anything but a breath of the recycled air, felt a physical blow. He stood there, his dignity crumbling on the pristine carpet, as the CEO ordered security to humiliate him. They dumped Stanley's bag onto the floor, scattering his simple lunch thermos and his worn wallet, searching every pocket as if he were a common thief. He was suspended on the spot, his reputation shredded, his livelihood gone, accused of a crime he didn't commit, simply because he was easy to frame. Stanley walked out of that building that night with his head held high, though his soul was shaking. He had to face the unthinkable. How was he going to tell Eleanor, his sick wife, that he had lost everything? He knew the stress of this shame could literally stop her heart. But here is the secret. The truth nobody in that high tower knew. The piece of information that makes this whole terrible story a matter of absolute corporate war. Stanley Walker, the humiliated janitor accused of stealing a $45,000 watch, is the father of Harold Walker, the chairman of the board. And now, the man who cleaned the floors was forced to hide the truth from his sick wife, while his powerful son, the master of Cornerstone Capital Partners, remained completely unaware that his own father had just been publicly destroyed. The 70-pound weight of Stanley's silence pressed down on his shoulders as he drove the familiar route home. The humiliation, the frantic, aggressive search by CEO Derek Callahan, the scattering of his meager possessions, the implied criminality, was a cold, oily film that refused to wash off. He felt stripped of his name, reduced merely to a function: the janitor. He pulled into the driveway. The two-story white clapboard house stood in stark contrast to the mirrored 50-story monolith of Cornerstone Capital Partners. Inside, warmth and truth awaited. Outside, corporate cruelty and deceit held sway. Stanley entered the kitchen. Eleanor was carefully watering her orchids, humming softly. The scent of cinnamon and quiet domesticity hit him, a painful reminder of everything Callahan had just jeopardized. "Stanley," she said, her voice soft as worn velvet, "you're home early." He swallowed the lie, tasting the bitter ash of the tower in his mouth. He managed a smile, a shaky construct of muscle memory. "Yes, darling. The company, they are restructuring the cleaning schedule. I've been granted mandatory time off for the next few days. A sort of extended paid leave. Eleanor turned. Her eyes, though clouded by the persistent weariness of her heart condition, were sharp. Stanley had 40 years of history with those eyes. They were trained to read the slightest tremor in his resolve. Restructuring, she repeated slowly, tilting her head. Stanley, your independence is your religion. You haven't taken an unscheduled day off in 14 years. You hate disruption. What did they say, exactly? A cold sweat broke across his forehead. Stanley hated himself for the deception, but the alternative, telling her his reputation was destroyed, that his steady, reliable income was gone, that he was accused of grand theft, would send her fragile system into crisis. It's a new corporate initiative, he insisted, walking quickly to her, embracing her tightly to hide the slight but persistent shake in his hands. They want us refreshed for the upcoming audit season. I told them I didn't need it, but the new CEO, Callahan, he's insistent on this wellness strategy. 3 days, paid. A perfect chance for us to finally watch that series you wanted. Eleanor settled into the embrace, a deep sigh escaping her. She felt the tension radiating from him, tight and vibrational, like a plucked, low guitar string. She knew the narrative was fractured, but she respected the wall he had built to protect her. "All right, my love," she murmured, accepting the necessary fiction. 3 days. Let's make the most of it. The physical cost of the deceit was immediate. A headache that felt like a compression vise around his skull and a knot in his stomach that made the thought of food repulsive. He was fighting a hidden war, and the first casualty was his own integrity. 2 miles away, in the corporate heart of the Loop, Harold Walker sat late in the chairman's private office, a cool, sterile chamber high above the city's gridlock. He was reviewing a stack of quarterly reports when a summary dismissal notice regarding a janitorial staff member, Walker S., crossed his desk. The details were scant. Summary termination. Alleged theft of high-value personal property. A $45,000 Patek Philippe. No internal hearing conducted. Harold leaned back, steepled his fingers, and stared at the file photo of a slight, 60-something man whose face was blurry with low resolution. $45,000, Harold muttered. The immediate termination smelled foul. Callahan, the new CEO, had a reputation for cutting corners and excessive displays of authority. But this was beyond the pale. Harold didn't care about the janitor named Walker. He cared about the integrity of his corporation. Stanley had instilled in him the absolute requirement for unimpeachable process and the dignity of every job, no matter how small. A summary firing based on the CEO's word was an invitation to liability and moral decay. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Get IT on the line. I want a full security audit initiated immediately regarding the timeline of that theft. Specifically, pull all badge swipe logs, elevator movements, and localized CCTV footage from floors 36 through 40 for the period between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock a.m. today. Use the official regulatory compliance flag. Make it discreet, but make it fast." The corporate machinery started churning, driven by Harold's silent need for systemic truth, the very truth that would eventually shatter his prepared distance and reveal his father's suffering. Meanwhile, 1 floor below Harold, senior auditor Grace Thornton was already deep in the mathematics of justice. Grace had been humiliated by Callahan 6 months prior when she questioned his expense reporting regarding a dubious client dinner. She was publicly reprimanded and internally demoted. She never forgot. When the internal notice flashed across the corporate network, Walker S. Janitorial Services terminated for grand theft, Grace saw not a crime, but a convenient cover story. She bypassed the official IT request process and used her deep auditor privileges to access the badge swipe logs directly. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for anomalies in the pattern of invisible lives. The log showed Callahan's office entrance, floor 38, time-stamped at 9:07 a.m. The alleged theft, according to Callahan's statement, occurred immediately upon his entry. Grace cross-referenced the janitorial access log for that exact moment. The screen glowed, displaying the cold, irrefutable evidence of digital movement. ID 4192, Stanley Walker. Access granted. Floor 12, East Wing Closet. Time 09/3/07/11 a.m. Stanley Walker was physically 12 floors away, 3 elevator rides removed, when Callahan claimed the watch was stolen. An unimpeachable alibi, secured by the company's own infrastructure. A grim satisfaction settled over Grace. This was not just about the janitor. This was about Callahan's malignant deception. She quickly downloaded the log onto a secure external drive, labeled with a cryptic code. But the logs only proved Stanley wasn't there. They didn't prove why Callahan lied or who saw the CEO last. Grace needed a witness, a living, breathing counterpoint to Callahan's polished fiction. She turned her focus to the janitorial team's movement tracker. She zeroed in on the immediate adjacent area to Callahan's office, the coffee station and utility closet on the 38th floor, and identified the staff member who logged out just before Stanley logged in on floor 12. Marcus Brown. Marcus, a thick-set man of 52, was known for his dedication to his pension and his quiet friendship with Stanley. Grace found his internal extension and sent an anonymous, encrypted text message. Urgent. Stanley Walker. Meet me at Millennium Park Fountain tonight, 7 p.m. Integrity requires truth. At his apartment, Marcus Brown reread the strange, anonymous text message 3 times. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from moral dread. He was sitting on a bomb of truth. Marcus had seen Stanley leave the executive floor. He had then returned to the 38th floor utility closet 10 minutes after Stanley had gone to retrieve a misplaced bucket. As he slipped out of the closet, he distinctly saw CEO Callahan standing by the panoramic window, admiring his reflection in the glass, adjusting the large, ornate face of the Patek Philippe watch. It was 9:21 a.m., 15 minutes after the supposed theft. Callahan had been wearing the watch. Marcus had said nothing when he heard the rumors, paralyzed by the fear of losing his pension and his invisibility. Testifying meant stepping out of the shadows and directly into the path of the most powerful man in the building. But Stanley was his friend. 7 o'clock that evening, Marcus was waiting near the fountain, bathed in the orange glow of the city lights, terrified. He met Grace Thornton, who wasted no time. She showed him the badge logs, confirming Stanley's distance. "The data clears him," Grace said, her voice low and crisp. "But Callahan has deleted the security logs for that specific area, claiming a server malfunction. We need a human witness to bridge the gap." "Marcus, you were there. Did you see the watch?" Marcus swallowed hard. His moral duty fought a brutal battle with his decades of self-preservation. He looked at the fountain, then back at Grace, seeing only the ruthless marble towers looming behind her. "Yes," he whispered, the single word feeling like a betrayal of his silence. "He was wearing it at 21 minutes after 9 o'clock. He hadn't noticed me." "That's everything," Grace breathed. "That establishes the time frame for his staged theft. We go public. Tomorrow." Stanley spent his first day of paid leave trapped in a perfect, suffocating cage of quiet dread. He kept the television volume high to mask his own racing pulse. Every time Eleanor coughed or rose too quickly from her chair, Stanley's heart seized. He had spent his life building a foundation of truth and resilience, only to have to watch it dissolve into a toxic blend of corporate lies and domestic deception. That night, Stanley woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat. He looked over. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, gripping her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged, a frantic whistling sound escaping her throat. "Stanley!" she gasped, her eyes wide with fear. I can't catch it. It feels like a vice." The immense, sustained stress of Stanley's suppressed terror, the 68-year-old weight of maintaining the facade, had finally broken through their shared reality. Eleanor was suffering a sudden, acute cardiac event. Stanley leaped out of bed, his earlier concerns about a stolen watch vanishing in a horrifying wave of panic. He fumbled for his phone, the emergency lights of the bedside clock reading 3:14 a.m. As he waited for the ambulance sirens to shatter the silence of the pre-dawn street, Stanley looked at his wife, pale and fighting for air. He realized the corporate injustice was no longer an issue of dignity or employment. It had become a direct, existential threat, fueled by his own inability to tell the crushing, necessary truth. He rushed Eleanor to the front door, shouting instructions through the phone to the arriving paramedics. Just as he was signing her over, his cell phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number, Grace Thornton, who had somehow obtained his contact information. Stanley, tears blurring his vision, barely registered the text. "We have the proof. Callahan staged the theft at 9:21. Don't talk to anyone until tomorrow. We have the alibi and the witness." But Stanley didn't need proof of corporate corruption. He needed a working heart for the woman he loved. He watched the ambulance doors slam shut, the red lights flashing a terrifying rhythm against the encroaching dawn. The corporate battle had just become a life-or-death confrontation, and Stanley Walker stood alone in his driveway, his career destroyed, his reputation sullied, and his wife speeding toward the emergency room, while the only truth he possessed was a text message proving his innocence against a crime that now seemed insignificantly small compared to the looming shadow of Eleanor's possible death. Stanley ran to his car, knowing he had to follow the ambulance, but as he reached for the driver's side door handle, the car phone received an automated call. A voice message alert. It was Harold Walker, his son, the chairman, delivering a cold, controlled corporate instruction, utterly unaware of the domestic catastrophe unfolding around Stanley. "This is a required, documented notice," Harold's voice stated clinically, devoid of emotion. "The compliance review has found an intentional deletion of server data corresponding to the time frame of the alleged theft. The IT team is initiating a Level 1 data recovery protocol. The janitor involved, Walker S., is required to appear for an internal hearing immediately upon resolution of the compliance review, which I anticipate concluding within 48 hours. Failure to appear will result in mandatory referral to the authorities. Consider this your final corporate warning." Stanley stood frozen beside his car, trapped between the screaming urgency of the siren disappearing down the street and the brutal, dispassionate demand for his immediate corporate surrender. His son, driven by the need for systemic process, was unknowingly threatening his already devastated father with jail time, and the deadline was 2 days away. Stanley did not go to the internal hearing. The corporate demand, though delivered by his son's cold, demanding structure, was rendered entirely moot by the human crisis before him. The sterile marble and glass of Cornerstone Capital Partners evaporated, replaced by the antiseptic reality of the emergency room. He found Eleanor in the critical care unit, a spiderweb of wires and monitors surrounding her frail body. Her face, usually alight with a quiet, enduring strength, was bleached of color. The relentless, mechanical beep-beep-beep of the cardiac monitor was the only sound that mattered now, drowning out the distant echo of Harold's 48-hour corporate ultimatum. "Stanley," she whispered, her voice barely a breathy rasp. Her hand, cold and papery, found his. He grasped it, forcing a calm smile he did not feel. "Just resting, honey. The doctors said, you just need to take it easy. Too much excitement." Eleanor's eyes, however, were keen. They always were. It's not the excitement, Stanley. It's the quiet. She paused, monitoring the flicker of fear in his eyes. You're hiding something. It's heavy. Whatever it is, it's crushing you. Stanley swallowed the lump of panic and guilt, knowing that to tell her the truth now, that he was accused of theft, suspended, and facing jail time, could easily trigger another, final episode. Just stress at work, Ellie. You know how the new CEO is. I got laid off. Part of downsizing. I have plenty of severance. We'll be fine. He repeated the lie until the nurses returned to administer medication, temporarily silencing her intuition and plunging her into a fragile, medicated sleep. Stanley sat beside her bed, his head bowed. The weight of the two lies, the lie about the theft and the lie about his son, bearing down on him, magnified by the sound of her struggling breath. His fear was no longer for his job. It was for the very foundation of his life. 42 floors above the city, Derek Callahan, frantic and sweat-drenched, stared at his computer screen. Harold Walker's corporate compliance team was digging, and their recovery protocol was alarmingly effective. They're accessing the temporary cache files, his private IT consultant hissed over the phone line. The badge logs are clean, but the temporary files still contain the metadata from your initial access attempts, showing you logged in 15 minutes after the alleged theft to look at the CCTV footage. You didn't delete the logs, Derek. You just hid them. Callahan slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk. He was a man running on pure adrenaline and terror. The collection agency had escalated the threats. He needed the $45,000 insurance payout from the stolen watch immediately to cover his short-term debt and buy 48 hours of safety. He realized the internal hearing was now a liability. If Stanley Walker showed up, he would be given a platform to speak, and Harold Walker's process would require diligence. Bypass the process. Callahan fired up his laptop. He typed a quick, brutal memo, bypassing HR and leveraging his CEO authority. Subject: immediate termination. Walker, S. Contract violation. Effective immediately due to non-compliance with the official request for an internal hearing and presumptive guilt based on the findings of initial evidence review. Stanley Walker is terminated for cause, effective immediately. All access, including building access and company email, is revoked. Security is authorized to retrieve company property. He clicked send before his trembling hands could stop him. Stanley Walker was officially ruined. The narrative sealed. Callahan sat back, breathing heavily. The scapegoat was silenced. Now, he just had to delete the final metadata trail before Harold Walker's team found it. In the cool, windowless server room on floor 15, Grace Thornton was operating in a state of controlled fury. Callahan's panicked corporate maneuvers were amateurish, but effective. Stanley was gone. He didn't just fire him, Grace muttered, reviewing the access logs for the termination memo. He did it now to prevent the hearing. He's running scared. She pivoted from the CCTV access to the financial database. She wasn't just investigating a stolen watch. She was hunting for motive. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing Callahan's expense reports against his personal bank activity, flagged by the compliance software. The pattern was ugly, and it was immediate. Cash withdrawals, massive, irregular, totaling 6 figures over the last 4 months. Wire transfers, multiple transfers routed through offshore accounts linked to shell companies. Internal note. Tag. A corporate lawyer had flagged an unusual escalating expenditure marked settlement of personal business liabilities. Grace stared at the bottom line, cold certainty settling in her stomach. Derek Callahan wasn't stealing a watch for greed. He was stealing to survive the collapse of his image. She scrolled through the notes on the largest transfer, $120,000, and saw the name of the recipient. a known, if marginally legal, collection agency operating out of Cicero. $120,000, Grace whispered. Gambling debt. He needed $45,000 now, and pinning the theft on Stanley bought him the insurance payout and time. She now had the complete truth, alibi, means, and motive, but the evidence was still digital. She needed unimpeachable human confirmation. Grace lifted her secure burner phone and dialed the number she had acquired for Marcus Brown, the only janitor who had risked speaking the truth off the record. "Marcus, it's Grace Thornton," she said, keeping her voice low and tight. "I know why Callahan did it. He's in six-figure debt. He needed to stage the theft." There was a long silence on the line, punctuated by the nervous shuffling of the man she knew was risking everything. "I saw him, Ms. Thornton," Marcus finally conceded, his voice barely audible. "I saw the watch. It was about 9 o'clock. 15 minutes after he said Mr. Walker took it." "Where was it?" Grace pressed. "Did you see it on his wrist? Did you see him holding it?" "It wasn't on his wrist," Marcus whispered, the sound of a mop bucket clanging faintly in the background, a reminder of the world they were both risking. "It was— I saw him put it somewhere. I was just passing by the office when the door opened and shut quickly. He was fiddling with his desk. I saw the glint, Miss Thornton. He wasn't wearing it. He was placing it inside the—" Suddenly, the line went dead. Grace heard a sharp, choked gasp, followed by a metallic crash, and then nothing but a cold dial tone. She immediately redialed, but the phone went straight to voicemail. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Marcus had just been about to reveal the hidden location of the missing Patek Philippe's, the final physical proof that would expose Callahan and save Stanley. Did someone hear him? Did Callahan's surveillance catch the conversation? Simultaneously, Stanley Walker, sitting vigil beside his sleeping wife, felt the violent vibration of his old cell phone in his pocket. It was a corporate email notification. He opened it slowly, dread curling in his gut, and read the stark, unemotional text of his immediate, irreversible termination. At that exact moment, a doctor in navy scrubs approached Stanley's chair, his face a mask of profound gravity. "Mr. Walker," the doctor said, laying a gentle hand on Stanley's shoulder, "I need to talk to you about Eleanor's condition. The medication is failing to stabilize her rhythm. We need to prepare for a cardiac intervention. Immediately. The next few hours are absolutely—" The sterile, biting chill of the hospital air suddenly felt like a physical weight pressing against Stanley's lungs. He was simultaneously drowning in the corporate cruelty represented by the cold, digital typeface of the termination notice and the raw, agonizing fear delivered by the doctor's steady voice. The words of the email, immediate, irreversible termination, failure to uphold fiduciary trust, referral to external security agencies, were meaningless static compared to the doctor's urgent pronouncement, "We need to prepare for a cardiac intervention. Immediately. The next few hours are absolutely critical." Stanley's hands, which had spent 14 years moving silently, diligently, now trembled, crumpling the flimsy printout of the email. He swallowed the metallic taste of panic. Everything he had worked for, the quiet dignity, the self-reliance, the ability to pay for the care that kept Eleanor breathing, was gone in 2 lines of text. He looked past the doctor, past the nurses moving with muted urgency, toward the glass-walled room where Eleanor lay small and pale beneath the green monitor's pulsing light. His wife, his entire foundation, was fading. And the one thing he needed to secure her stability, his job, his insurance, his means, had just been violently yanked away by a liar 50 years his junior. A deep, unfamiliar reservoir of heat spread through Stanley's chest, a burning, contained rage that felt far more dangerous than despair. He placed the phone back in his pocket and faced the doctor. "What is the risk?" Stanley's voice was low, flat, stripped of all inflection. "Significant, Mr. Walker. Her heart is struggling to maintain rhythm under the current stress load. We need to introduce a temporary measure to keep her stable while we look at long-term solutions." Stanley simply nodded, absorbing the details, signing the forms, forcing the raw terror into a small steel box deep within himself. He was now operating on pure, desperate necessity. Eleanor's life was the singular goal. Callahan's watch, the corporation, the $45,000 theft, all of it felt distant, abstract, yet terrifyingly real in its consequence. The converging paths. Across town, in the high-ceilinged glass office tower Stanley was now forbidden to enter, Grace Thornton was running on 3 hours of sleep and cold coffee. The termination email, which she had intercepted via a general system notification, had crystallized her purpose. Callahan was moving to seal the story, eradicating the janitor before any official inquiry could begin. Grace located Marcus Brown, finding him on his scheduled break, in the silent subterranean boiler room. Marcus looked ill, his face gray beneath the flickering fluorescent light. He was holding a laminated family photo. "He terminated Stanley," Grace stated, skipping the pleasantries. Marcus flinched, leaning against a warm pipe. "I figured. He's tying off loose ends." "If I talk, Grace, I lose everything. My pension, my health coverage, my wife." "If you don't talk, Marcus, the liar wins," Grace countered, her voice sharp with professional disdain. "He framed an innocent man for $45,000 to cover up his own gambling debt. We have the clock logs, we have the timestamps, but we need a witness who saw the CEO with the watch after the supposed theft. We need you to confirm you saw Derek Callahan walking into his office with that flashy thing on his wrist at 7:45 a.m. on Tuesday." Marcus looked at the pipe, then at the floor. The debt he owed was not financial, but moral. The image of Stanley, always quiet, always dignified, being treated like filth, hardened his resolve. 7:45 a.m., Marcus whispered, confirming the critical 15-minute gap. The diamond face caught the light just before he went into the 38th floor elevator bank. "I saw it, clear as day." "Good," Grace said, relief washing over her. "Now, we move fast. I've lined up a lawyer, pro bono, a former colleague of mine who handles complex corporate fraud. We need to meet Stanley immediately. Tell no one. Not security, not management." Chapter 3. The Consolidation of Truth. 2 hours later, Stanley sat rigidly in the small, temporary office of Rachel Simmons, a sharp, 50-year-old litigation expert whose energy filled the cramped space. Marcus sat nervously beside him, fiddling with a pen. Grace, eyes burning with a focused intensity, laid out the evidence on the scratched veneer desk. Rachel reviewed the materials. The cornerstone badge log showing Stanley scanning into the 12th floor maintenance closet at 7:30 a.m. The testimony from Marcus confirming Callahan wearing the watch 15 minutes later. Grace's data showing the sudden panicked spike in Callahan's private account withdrawals, corresponding exactly to a series of escalating threats from known high-interest creditors. "This is an airtight case for wrongful termination and fraud," Rachel stated, her finger tracing the debt figures. "The motive is clear, the alibi is unimpeachable, and the witness testimony corroborates the frame job. Callahan terminated you, Mr. Walker, to cover his tracks before a formal investigation could start." Stanley listened to the clinical dissection of his life's humiliation. He looked at the faces of the two people who had risked their careers for him. Grace, motivated by justice, and Marcus, motivated by conscience. "I appreciate the pro bono help, Rachel," Stanley said quietly, "but I need more than a settlement. I need the truth, public. I need my name cleared by facts, not by a confidentiality clause." Rachel nodded, sensing the profound weight of the man before her. "We can certainly pursue criminal charges, Mr. Walker, but given his position, Callahan will fight us with every resource Cornerstone has. We need leverage to force a rapid public disclosure." Stanley leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He took a slow, deep breath, preparing to tear down the wall he had carefully maintained for 14 years. He had to trust these strangers with the one thing that could ensure victory, yet could also undermine the moral high ground he sought. "There is leverage," Stanley said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. He looked directly into Rachel's skeptical eyes. "I haven't told anyone at Cornerstone this, except Eleanor. Not the security team, not Marcus, not Grace. I wanted to fight this as Stanley Walker, the janitor, the man who earned his wage." He paused, gathering the rest of his strength. The memory of Eleanor struggling for breath, the doctor's grim face, the time for quiet dignity, was over. "But now, I need to protect my wife, and I need to use everything I have to ensure the truth comes out before he destroys more lives." Rachel and Grace exchanged a confused glance. Marcus looked away, sensing the magnitude of the coming revelation. "My son," Stanley stated clearly, the word ringing with unspoken power, "is Harold Walker, the chairman of the board." Kirkitz. The silence that descended on the small office was immediate and complete, thick enough to be sliced by a knife. Rachel's jaw tightened in professional shock. Grace's eyes widened, the realization of the full corporate drama slamming into her with stunning force. The chairman's father was the janitor accused of a $45,000 theft. The implications were seismic. "Stanley," Rachel breathed, recovering quickly, "why did you hide this? Dignity, and to protect him. I refused his financial help, but now he is the key to timing. He has a mandatory board meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. That is where we present the evidence. Not a lawsuit, not a police report first. A public confrontation, with the board present, and with Harold Walker watching." Rachel leaned back, considering the immense risk and the immense reward. A hostile internal action. Brilliant. If we can get him on the agenda, this will be over by noon. She began sketching a timeline, coordinating with Grace. Grace, still reeling, checked her secure connection. Harold Walker's team had indeed escalated their silent internal inquiry, auditing all system activity, including Grace's own recent CCTV pulls. Harold was preparing for war. "I have the final piece," Grace announced, pulling up a cryptic data packet. "I just linked Callahan's private burner phone to a geolocation tracker tied to his debt collectors. He has completely depleted his available credit lines at the casino. He is panicked. He knows the board meeting is his last chance to spin the story. If he fails, he won't stick around for the police." Rachel's eyes gleamed with strategic focus. "Then we hit him immediately after the opening statements tomorrow. We need to prepare the evidence deck for a presentation that cannot be denied. Stanley, you need to be ready to walk into that boardroom tomorrow and face him." "Will you do it?" Stanley Walker looked at the floor, picturing Eleanor's fragile form in the hospital. He thought of the $45,000, the petty cruelty, the destruction of his career. "I will be there," he affirmed, the quiet resolve in his voice chilling. "But I need to get back to the hospital tonight. The doctor said Eleanor is scheduled for the cardiac intervention at midnight." Bowie, as the team solidified the strategy, the air thick with anticipation and adrenaline, Grace received an urgent, encrypted notification on her laptop. She clicked it open, her face draining of color as she read the content. "Rachel, wait," Grace whispered, tapping the screen. "Callahan didn't just delete the watch from the surveillance footage. He deleted all of the security tapes surrounding his office for the entire week. He thinks he's clean. But my audit captured something else, something he didn't realize was visible on the metadata." Rachel rushed over, leaning in close. The image displayed was a compressed, grainy screenshot of a text message sent from Callahan's burner phone 30 minutes after he terminated Stanley. The recipient was clearly the lead creditor, a known figure in organized crime circles. The message read, "The old man is gone. Clean sweep. The money is locked up, but I need $75K by dawn, or I give them what they need." "He's not running," Grace whispered, horrified. "He's planning to destroy the evidence. The watch isn't the real problem. The real threat is what he's offering to sell to his creditors to buy himself more time. That $86,000 loss we flagged last month, the one he blamed on a server error, that was real. And he's threatening to expose Cornerstone's illegal offshore funding structure if they don't erase his debt immediately." Rachel stared at the message, the full scale of Callahan's desperate criminality expanding exponentially. This wasn't just a watch theft. This was corporate blackmail aimed at the highest echelons of the firm Stanley Walker's son controlled. "My God," Rachel murmured, her mind racing to connect the dots. "If he exposes the offshore structure, the entire firm collapses, dragging the chairman, your son, down with it. We need to secure that evidence before he—" A second notification flashed on Grace's screen, a geolocation ping. Callahan's burner phone was moving fast, southbound, toward a known, low-profile warehouse district where the debt collectors were known to conduct their business. "He's meeting them now," Grace choked out. "He's giving them the collateral to ensure their silence, or worse, the files themselves." Stanley Walker stood up abruptly, the quiet janitor replaced by the father whose family and life's work were on the precipice of absolute ruin. The hospital, the cardiac intervention, the board meeting, everything was now secondary to the immediate, desperate race against a collapsing corporate empire. "Rachel, you contact Harold," Stanley commanded, grabbing his worn coat. "Tell him everything. Tell him his window is closing. I have to go to the hospital. But if Callahan manages to sell those files tonight—" He didn't finish the sentence. He turned and bolted from the office, leaving the legal team paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that the battle for one man's dignity had instantly transformed into a deadly race to save Cornerstone Capital Partners from catastrophic ruin. A ruin that Callahan, the panicked CEO, was currently speeding toward, prepared to detonate everything unless he secured an impossible financial lifeline, proving that the price of one stolen watch was just the smallest fraction of the immense, deadly secret Derek Callahan was holding hostage. The phone call reached Harold Walker in the sterile, soundproof silence of his corner office, a chamber where gravity usually obeyed his slightest command. Rachel Simmons's voice, clipped and frantic, punched through the quiet like a sonic boom. "Mr. Walker, it's not just the watch anymore," she stated, skipping all pleasantries. "Callahan is actively moving high-value corporate data, trade secrets, client manifests. He's trying to sell proprietary assets to cover that debt. Tonight, this wasn't about a cover-up. It was about buying time for a hostile extraction." Harold felt the blood drain from his face. The intellectual exercise he had been conducting, the meticulous gathering of unimpeachable proof to satisfy his father's code of honor, had just been violently overridden by corporate survival. If Cornerstone Capital's proprietary data hit the open market, the resulting civil liabilities and market crash would dwarf the $45,000 Patek Philippe. Stanley's dignity was now inextricably linked to the continued existence of the firm Harold had built. "How certain are you?" Harold demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Stanley overheard him talking about a quick-turn asset sale with someone shady on his cell phone before the suspension was official. Grace Thornton confirmed the transfer logs show massive outbound data packets scheduled for transfer tonight. "He's liquidating us to escape the bookies." Harold slammed his hand onto the polished obsidian desk. the sound swallowed immediately by the thick carpet. "Find Grace. Tell her to send me everything she has immediately. Encrypted. I need the smoking gun evidence against Callahan within the next 5 minutes. We are moving this meeting up. We are not waiting for the board tomorrow. This ends tonight. 5 blocks away, in the deep recesses of Cornerstone's data analytics floor, Grace Thornton was performing the final, most crucial review. Her focus was absolute, driven by a cold, righteous fury. Callahan had used her, humiliated her, and now he was trying to ruin the company she had dedicated her life to protecting. She pulled up the high-resolution 30-second loop of the executive hallway footage, zooming in pixel by pixel. The light was harsh, reflecting off the mahogany paneling. Callahan entered his office at precisely 1 minute and 32 seconds past 9 in the morning, 15 minutes after Stanley Walker had clocked out of the 38th floor. Grace paused the footage. Callahan was wearing the watch, the bulky, diamond-encrusted timepiece, as he entered. She advanced the frames slowly. 1 second. 2 seconds. Callahan closes the door. He walks toward his desk. He rubs his tired eyes, then glances down at his wrist. 3 seconds. 4. He slips the Patek Philippe off. Grace held her breath. This was it. The moment of staged loss. He didn't pocket it. He didn't drop it. He opened the top right-hand drawer of his desk, the drawer that contained his personal effects and a small electronic lockbox, and carefully laid the glittering watch inside. Then, with a deliberate, calculated movement, Callahan pulled his phone from his trouser pocket, stepped back into the doorway, and placed the call to security, reporting the theft that had, by his own hand, never occurred. Grace felt a spike of pure, exhilarating vindication. The perfect alibi was one thing. The visual evidence of the crime's creation was devastating. She captured the high-resolution, time-stamped clip, packaged it with the badge logs, Marcus Brown's witness statement, and the complete audit trail proving Callahan's $120,000 gambling debt. The evidence package, the truth, was sent to Harold Walker's secure server. Harold Walker received the digital file, verified the encryption, and downloaded the footage. He watched the 30-second clip twice. The cold, mechanical betrayal on Callahan's face was sickeningly clear. He immediately contacted his chief of security. "We have an emergency. Locate Derek Callahan. Now. He is not to leave the city. Alert the private corporate jet terminal. If he attempts to file a manifest, veto the flight immediately." 5 minutes later, the location ping came through. Callahan wasn't at a corporate high-rise. He was at a converted warehouse in the South Loop, used by high-end investors for discreet, off-the-books transactions. The perfect location to sell the corporate soul. "Grace, meet me at the South Loop warehouse, street address 50751. Bring the hard drive with the original footage. I'm mobilizing security and contacting 2 key board members who trust me implicitly. We are crashing this private meeting," Harold ordered, his voice echoing the absolute authority of the chairman. "On my way," Grace confirmed, already grabbing her coat and the small sealed drive. Derek Callahan wiped the sweat from his brow. The lights in the warehouse loft were harsh, illuminating the cheap folding table and the 2 austere, heavy-set men seated across from him. These weren't investment bankers. They were corporate scavengers, eager to buy data to execute short-selling attacks against Cornerstone. He placed the encrypted drive containing the company's core client manifest on the table. "Everything you need is on here. Proprietary trading algorithms, client acquisition data for the last 5 years. Enough to cripple the stock." One of the buyers, a man named Denton, smiled, a thin, cruel line. "And the price? $150,000. Cash transfer. Now." Callahan felt his stomach twist. He hated this, but the creditors, the men who owned his debt, were due tomorrow morning. This was his only escape. Denton chuckled, a dry, grating sound. 150,000 for your entire career, Mr. Callahan? Done. He reached for a briefcase. Just as Denton's fingers brushed the latch, the heavy steel door at the back of the loft shuddered, followed by a sudden, violent kick that splintered the frame. Harold Walker, radiating cold fury and flanked by two hulking security personnel, stood framed in the wreckage of the doorway. Next to him, slender but resolute, was Grace Thornton, clutching the physical evidence of Callahan's lies. Callahan stared, paralyzed. His elaborate two-day deception had collapsed into immediate catastrophic reality. Mr. Callahan, Harold's voice cut through the air, icy and definitive. The assets of Cornerstone Capital Partners are not yours to sell, and neither is the reputation of an innocent man. Harold took two purposeful steps forward, closing the distance between the chairman and the ruined CEO. He raised the evidence package high enough for everyone to see. We have the footage of you staging the theft of your watch. We have the data log that proves you tried to frame Stanley Walker, my father, to cover your gambling debts. Your meeting here is over, and your time at Cornerstone is finished. The two buyers at the table exchanged tense glances, their briefcases remaining locked. Callahan, realizing his escape route was cut off and his lies exposed to the highest authority, lunged desperately for the table, attempting to grab the drive and destroy the evidence, to salvage one final chaotic moment of control. Harold Walker did not hesitate. He moved with the precision of a trained executive, intercepting Callahan with a powerful, shoulder-driven shove. Callahan stumbled back, crashing into the flimsy wall. In the ensuing split second of silence, Harold looked down at the client manifest drive on the table, then across the room at the two silent, armed security guards blocking the exit. He knew he had the evidence and the authority to terminate Callahan and retrieve the assets. But the buyers were still present, witnesses to corporate malfeasance, and dangerously close to the sensitive data. Harold looked at Grace. He looked at the hard drive containing the company's lifeblood. He knew that if he grabbed the drive, Callahan might try to escape or fight back. If he focused on securing Callahan, the buyers might grab the data. He had to choose between immediate physical security and securing the critical corporate data. Just as Harold made his choice, the first buyer, Denton, lunged for the drive, his hand flying across the table toward the catastrophic information. Harold Walker simultaneously pivoted, throwing himself across the table just as the buyer's hand closed around the drive, while behind him, Derek Callahan, driven by blind terminal panic, found a heavy steel pipe amidst the debris of the doorframe and raised it high above his head, ready to swing. The steel pipe, rusted from years spent forgotten in the building's subterranean infrastructure and heavy with destructive potential, ripped through the air just inches from Harold Walker's head. A sickening thwack vibrated through the high-ceilinged room as the pipe struck the polished cherry wood of the boardroom table. The force was so immense that a section of the wood split cleanly, sending sharp splinters flying, one of which embedded itself painfully deep into the meaty part of Harold's forearm as he shielded the hard drive. Harold roared, not from pain, but from the primal necessity of protection. His adrenaline spiked, canceling the stinging in his arm. He used the momentum of Callahan's violent swing to his advantage, driving his shoulder into Denton's chest, pinning the buyer against the table edge. The hard drive, momentarily forgotten by the shocked buyer, was snatched by Harold's non-injured hand and pressed against his side. Callahan, his eyes white and desperate, raised the pipe again, preparing for the finishing blow. He was no longer a CEO. He was a trapped animal fighting for his life, driven by a fear far greater than bankruptcy, the fear of total public ruin and the brutal retribution of the men he owed. Before Callahan could bring the weapon down a second time, the heavy mahogany doors behind him burst inward. Not from impact, but from a sudden, organized breach. The security detail, delayed by the frantic silent alarm triggered by Grace, poured into the room, their movements sharp and practiced. Two uniformed guards moved instantly toward the source of the weapon, tackling Callahan mid-swing. The pipe clattered to the floor, rolling away from the ensuing chaotic struggle. Callahan screamed a sound that was less human, more an agonizing corporate death rattle. Denton, momentarily freed, looked wildly for an escape, but Grace Thornton materialized from the shadows near the screen, her face pale but hardened. She raised her phone, the screen displaying the explicit video footage, Callahan hiding the watch, and she spoke in a voice that was eerily calm amidst the wreckage. "It's over, Mr. Denton. The evidence is secured. You were used." The buyers, seeing the overwhelming security presence and the tangible evidence of their clients' crimes, realized their position was untenable. They were not corporate raiders. They were debtors and opportunists. With swift, almost synchronized resignation, they raised their hands. Harold stood slowly, blood staining the pristine white cuff of his bespoke shirt. He held the hard drive tightly, its cool plastic a soothing anchor against the chaos. He looked across the devastated room, the splintered table, the overturned chairs, the panicked faces of the board members who were frozen spectators to this brutal display of corporate rot. The silence that followed the capture of Callahan and the buyers was profound, punctuated only by Harold's ragged breathing and the distant sound of sirens drawing near. Grace walked to Harold, her eyes fixed on the crimson blossoming on his sleeve. "Are you all right, Harold?" "That was close." "It's just a scratch," Harold lied, though the ache in his arm radiated up to his shoulder. He nodded toward the now subdued Callahan, who was being cuffed, muttering incoherent pleas and curses. "Justice has a visceral price, doesn't it?" Harold then faced the board. Their faces, usually masks of detached financial scrutiny, were etched with shock and confusion. They had seen the technical evidence, the cold facts of the debt and the alibi, but they had not grasped the depth of the malice until the physical violence erupted. "Gentlemen," Harold said, his voice regaining its authority, tempered now by a sharp, unavoidable edge of fury. "You have seen the proof of theft, the cover-up, the financial ruin of the man who occupied the highest office in this company, and his desperate criminal attempt to destroy evidence and lives." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on the horrified faces of the corporate titans. He looked directly at James Kinsley, the oldest member, and a man who had known Harold since he was a child. "The evidence Grace presented is unimpeachable. The alibi stands. The motivation is clear. $120,000 in crippling gambling debt, covered by destroying the name of an innocent man." Harold took a deep, shuddering breath. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, folded piece of paper, Stanley's 14-year-old employment contract. He smoothed the creases slowly. "You voted earlier to ratify the termination of the janitor, Stanley Walker, based on the fabricated claim of theft. I asked for a stay of execution and an investigation. But now I offer the full truth, the one I had hoped would never need to be spoken in this room." Harold's gaze hardened, sweeping across the remaining board members. The room was deathly quiet. Even the guards were silent, holding their positions around the vanquished CEO. The man Callahan accused, the man whose quiet, honest dignity he tried to strip away. The invisible labor you dismissed as expendable chattel. Harold's voice broke slightly, recovering immediately with intense resolve. "Stanley Walker, the janitor, is not just some contractor." He paused for a dramatic, crushing moment, making eye contact with Kinsley, who looked back with dawning, terrible comprehension. "Stanley Walker is my father." A collective gasp swept through the room, a wave of profound, devastating realization that shook the foundations of their corporate assumptions. The janitor, the man they ignored, was the blood relative of the chairman. The man whose name Callahan had tried to soil was part of the very fabric of Cornerstone Capital. Harold stepped back and raised his hand towards the door leading to the anteroom. "And unlike the corrupt, debt-ridden liar you just witnessed, my father is here to look every one of you in the eye." The outer door opened slowly. Stanley Walker stepped into the wreckage. He was dressed in a simple, pressed shirt and trousers, immaculate despite the stress of the past 72 hours. He did not look at the blood on the table or the cuffed, defeated Callahan. He looked only at his son, Harold, standing bloodied but defiant, holding the victory of truth in his hand. Stanley's face was a study in profound, aching control. He saw the cut on Harold's arm, the exhaustion in his son's eyes, and the cost of the fight. Stanley had sought vindication, but he had never wanted Harold to risk physical violence to achieve it. The elder Walker nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the painful sacrifice. Harold returned the nod, a silent promise kept. "The motion is now simple, gentlemen. Given the clear, documented criminal actions of the current CEO, I move for the immediate and unanimous termination of Derek Callahan, effective immediately, with referral to the proper authorities for prosecution regarding theft, corporate malfeasance, and assault." The vote was a formality, a quiet, almost immediate consensus built on shared horror. The board members, desperate to distance themselves from the spectacle, raised their hands one by one. Unanimous. As two security officers began to drag a still ranting Callahan out of the room, Stanley watched him go. There was no hatred in Stanley's gaze, only the quiet, cold sorrow reserved for witnessing a self-inflicted destruction. The victory was complete. The truth had won. But as the door closed behind the disgraced CEO, the adrenaline drained from Stanley's body, leaving him exhausted. He walked past the wreckage, past the relieved faces of the board, and placed his hand gently on Harold's bloodied arm. "It is done, son," Stanley murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "It is done." Harold gripped his father's hand tightly, leaning into the contact. "You are clear, Dad. Your name is restored." "And Eleanor?" Stanley asked, his voice suddenly sharp with anxiety, the corporate war immediately dissolving into the cold reality of his life's true battle. Grace stepped forward, her professional distance dissolving into shared concern. "I checked her status 30 minutes ago, Mr. Walker. She is stable, but they are keeping her under observation for another night. The doctors said the stress almost—" She trailed off, unable to voice the gravity of the recent cardiac event. Stanley Walker turned away from the destruction and the vindication. The marble halls of Cornerstone Capital, the scene of his public shaming and his private triumph, suddenly felt utterly meaningless. The hard-won, bloody victory over Callahan paled in comparison to the quiet fear gripping his heart. He had fought for his dignity and won. Now he had to fight for the one thing that truly mattered. Stanley looked at Harold one last time, an overwhelming sense of gratitude mixing with the immense, personal terror of his wife's fragility. He knew he had to leave the high tower of wealth and power immediately. "I have to go to the hospital," Stanley stated, his voice flat with urgency. He walked swiftly out of the boardroom, leaving Harold and Grace to deal with the corporate aftermath, the press statements, the police reports, the administrative fallout. Stanley Walker left the tower without looking back, a janitor who had just humbled the chairman, carrying the heavy weight of true concern. He sped toward the hospital, the early afternoon light blurring around his small, worn car. As he navigated the traffic, his phone vibrated with an incoming call. It was the hospital. He pulled over immediately, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, and answered on the first ring. "This is Stanley Walker. Is Eleanor—" The voice on the other end was clinical, distant, yet imbued with a tone that made Stanley's blood run cold. "Mr. Walker, we need you to come to the intensive care unit immediately. Mrs. Walker had a sudden decline in her condition 5 minutes ago. We are working on stabilizing her, but her heart rate—" The voice of the doctor faded into a high-pitched whine that drowned out Stanley's immediate world. He didn't remember the drive, the parking, or the antiseptic smell of the intensive care unit lobby. He only remembered the fierce, unwavering pressure in his chest until he saw her. Eleanor was pale, framed by the white rails and the complex, rhythmic beeping of machinery that monitored the treacherous dance of her heart. After 72 excruciating hours, the crisis broke. The doctors stabilized her, the critical phase passed, and Stanley finally allowed himself to breathe. It was in the quiet, sterile room, with the morning sun cutting stripes across the linoleum floor, that Eleanor spoke the truth Stanley had tried so desperately to shield her from. "They fired you, didn't they, Stanley?" she whispered, her voice reedy but clear. Stanley, 68 years old, his shoulders weighted by 2 weeks of fear, guilt, and exhaustion, simply nodded. He confessed the accusation, the watch, Callahan's cruel public humiliation, and the reason he had tried to keep it secret. When he finished, Eleanor reached out a thin hand, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Stanley Walker," she said, her eyes piercing him. "You built a life on integrity. That is stronger than any money or title. Harold will fix the paperwork, but you must fix the truth for yourself." The following day, Harold Walker, chairman of the board, stepped into his father's hospital room. He didn't talk about the board meeting, the evidence, or the internal investigation that had been executed with the silent, brutal efficiency of a corporate military operation. He simply looked at Stanley, his powerful son kneeling by the bedside, and said, "It's done, Dad. You won the truth." Vindication. 1 week later, the Chicago sky was a clear, cold blue. Eleanor was home, resting comfortably, having secured Stanley's promise that he would return to his work not out of necessity, but out of choice, a choice rooted in the dignity of his labor. Stanley stood on the curb outside Cornerstone Capital Partners, holding the worn leather bag that contained his cleaning supplies and his thermos. His identification badge, the one Derek Callahan had tried to shred, was clipped to his dark blue uniform shirt. He walked through the massive bronze doors. The security guard, a man Stanley had silently acknowledged for 14 years, suddenly stood straighter. "Mr. Walker," the guard said, his voice hesitant, slightly awed. "Welcome back." Stanley simply nodded, the exchange more potent than any formal apology. He took the elevator to the 38th floor. The executive floor was silent, the marble polished to a blinding sheen. Stanley noticed the subtle differences. Callahan's nameplate was gone, replaced by a temporary plaque bearing the name of the interim chief executive officer. He started his shift exactly where he had left off, focusing on the meticulous rhythm of his work. He swept, he dusted, and he polished. He was halfway through emptying the shredder bins when he heard the approach of soft, professional footsteps. Grace Thornton stood there, dressed in a sharp black suit, a folder tucked under her arm. The rigid tension Stanley had often seen in her face was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined satisfaction. "Mr. Walker," she said softly, "I wanted to ensure you knew. Mr. Callahan was terminated, effective immediately, on grounds of gross corporate malfeasance and the attempted framing of a Cornerstone employee." She didn't mention the Patek Philippe watch, the gambling debts totaling $120,000, or the high-resolution video that showed Callahan calmly placing the timepiece into his own locked drawer 15 minutes before he screamed, "Theft!" to mask his fraudulent insurance claim. The evidence was secured. The justice delivered. "Thank you, Miss Thornton." Stanley replied, his voice level. He didn't ask for details. The feeling of his innocence restored was enough. Grace hesitated, then spoke a truth born from her own professional vengeance. It wasn't just your son, sir. It was the truth. You just happened to have the most powerful truth in the building. She departed, leaving Stanley alone in the quiet corridor. Marcus Brown, his fellow janitor, found him 10 minutes later near the supply closet. Marcus looked nervous, rubbing the back of his neck. "Stanley," Marcus whispered, "I heard everything about you and Mr. Harold." Stanley smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips. "I told him I didn't want the title. I just wanted my good name back." Marcus shook his head slowly, a mix of admiration and disbelief on his face. "Man, for 14 years, you worked here, cleaning up after him, and you never said a word?" "It wasn't necessary," Stanley said, picking up his bucket. "I earn my respect, Marcus. I don't demand it." The final balance. The final shift ended just as dawn broke over Lake Michigan. Stanley took the elevator down, the familiar scent of cleaning solution and freshly waxed floors clinging to his uniform. As he crossed the lobby, the rising sun hit the massive marble wall bearing the company's engraved motto, "Integrity is the cornerstone of capital." For Stanley, the motto had always been a bitter irony, a lie etched in stone above the heads of men like Callahan. But now, it resonated differently. Through the quiet diligence of an invisible janitor, through the ethical courage of an overlooked auditor, and through the respect of a son for his father's values, the foundational integrity of the corporation and the moral truth of a life had been tested and reaffirmed. Stanley stepped onto the sidewalk, the cold air bracing against his face. He was 68 years old. He had faced down the arrogance of corporate power and won, not with brute force or inherited wealth, but with the simple, unbreakable truth of his alibi and the unimpeachable record of his actions. He was going home to Eleanor, his heart mended and whole. He was no longer the invisible scapegoat. He was Stanley Walker, a man whose dignity was earned, visible, and utterly restored. He had returned to Cornerstone Capital Partners to prove that the world was wrong, that a man's worth was determined not by his title, but by the clean slate of his conscience. And today, Stanley's conscience was spotless.